In today's video, I am going to be making some N-acetylanthranilic acid. I'm going to be making it because according to Wikipedia, it is a supposedly triboluminescent material. To start the synthesis of acetylanthranilic acid, I firstly have to make antranilic acid from phthalimide. To make the phthalimide, I used 20 grams of phthalic anhydride and 4 grams of urea. I then added both of these into a flask. I turned on the hot plate and heated the flask until the reaction is complete. The reaction is done when the contents of the flask puffed up. When this happens, I let it cool down and then add in 100 milliliters of water. The phthalimide formed as a single solid chunk, so I broke it up with a glass rod. After breaking it into smaller pieces, I did a vacuum filtration. The phthalimide is still mixed in with unreacted urea and phthalic anhydride, so I cleaned it up by adding it to a beaker. And then I added in 500 milliliters of water. I turned on the heat and boiled the water for around 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, I turned off the heat from the hot plate. I did another vacuum filtration to separate the now purer phthalimide. I transferred all of the wet phthalimide to a beaker and dried it in the oven. Once it is dry, I measured the amount of phthalimide I got and it was 15 grams. Now that I had phthalimide, I began making the antranilic acid. I firstly got a flask and cooled it with an ice bath. I placed in a stir bar and poured in 60 milliliters of water. I turned on the stirring and slowly started adding 15 grams of sodium hydroxide in small portions. I then slowly poured in 65 milliliters of bleach, making sure that the temperature stays low. After adding all of the bleach, I took the flask out of the ice bath and added in 13 grams of phthalimide. When all of the phthalimide dissolves, I added in a sodium hydroxide solution by dissolving 11 grams of it in 40 milliliters of water. The flask was then heated at 80 degrees Celsius on a hot water bath for 30 minutes. After the 30 minutes, I then cooled it again with an ice bath. I then started adding concentrated hydrochloric acid until the pH level of the solution is at 3. At a pH of 3, the antranilic acid will precipitate out of the solution. Once the pH level is at 3, all of the antranilic acid precipitated out. I vacuum filtered the solution to separate the antranilic acid. I transferred all of the wet antranilic acid to a beaker and dried it in the oven. The yield of antranilic acid I got was 3 grams. Now that I have some antranilic acid, I can begin making N-acetylanthranilic acid. To start, I added all 3 grams of the antranilic acid I had just made into a flask. I then poured in 7.5 milliliters of acetic anhydride. I turned on the hot plate and start to heat the flask. After heating for a bit, the antranilic acid will start to dissolve and eventually form a clear solution with the acetic anhydride. I connected a condenser to the flask and started refluxing the solution for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I took the flask off the heat and let it cool down. Once it cooled back down to around 50 degrees Celsius, I added 3 milliliters of water. After adding the water, I placed it back on the hot plate and heated it until it started to boil. I took it off the hot plate when it started to boil. I then let the flask cool down in the freezer overnight. After chilling in the freezer, crystals of the N-acetylanthranilic acid crystallized out. I did a vacuum filtration to separate the crystals. I then washed the crystals with ice-cold ethanol. I transferred the crystals to a watch glass to dry it. Once it is dry, I measured the yield and I got 1.9 grams. Unfortunately, when I tried to crush the crystals, no blue flashes of light are produced. I didn't really know what to do now since the test for triboluminescence failed. I decided to just dispose of it since N-acetylanthranilic acid is actually a precursor to an illegal drug called methacrylone. And that will be it for this video. Bye.